The handcuffs were still warm from the last arrest when Officer Dale Rourke clicked them around her wrists. She didn't scream, she didn't cry. She just looked at him the way a surgeon looks at a scalpel, calculating, steady, already 3 steps ahead. Her neighbors watched from behind curtain gaps as the woman they knew as the quiet nurse from Briar Ridge was walked across her own driveway like a criminal. What they didn't know, what nobody in Kellerton, West Virginia had any reason to suspect, was that the woman in the faded green hoodie had once commanded a classified trauma unit in a combat zone where men twice Rourke's size had called her ma'am and meant it. They had just made the worst mistake of their careers. If this story has your attention, follow me now so you don't miss how this unfolds, and drop a like so more people find it. Tell me in the comments what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The morning had started the way most mornings did for Nora Voss. Badly, but manageably. She was up before 5, same as always. Not by choice, not because she had somewhere to be before her shift at Briar Ridge Regional Medical Center started at 7. She was up because she'd been waking at that hour for 11 years, since the first deployment, and her body had simply stopped believing that sleep past 4:50 was something civilians were entitled to. She made coffee without measuring anything, sat at the kitchen table with her hands around the mug, and stared at the crack in the linoleum near the back door that she kept meaning to fix. Outside, the neighborhood was still dark. The Kowalski house across the street had a porch light that flickered when the wind came through. She'd noticed that weeks ago. She noticed most things. Nora had been in Kellerton for 3 years. She had a rented house on Caldecott Lane with a detached garage she used more than the house itself. She had a 1979 Ford pickup in various states of reassembly on a hydraulic lift, a set of tools organized by function rather than size, because that made more sense. And a neighbor named Mrs. Okafor, who left jars of tomato stew on her porch without explanation or expectation. She had a job at Briar Ridge Regional that she was good at, though nobody there knew exactly how good, and she preferred it that way. She did not have friends, technically. She had people she was friendly with, which was different. Dr. Lemons in the ER, who appreciated that she didn't need instructions twice. Priya in the break room, who made her laugh without trying to. The overnight orderly, a kid named Spencer who was afraid of the chest defibrillators and told nobody but her. That was enough. That had always been enough. She finished the coffee, rinsed the mug, and went to the garage to work for 40 minutes before her shift. The truck didn't need her attention, but she needed the trucks. There was something about the weight of a wrench in her hand before 6 in the morning that settled her in a way nothing else did. Not meditation. She'd tried that during a mandatory wellness period in her second year post-service and found it condescending. Not running. Her left knee had opinions about running now. Just the truck. Just the work. She was under the chassis checking the new brake line she'd fitted 2 days ago when she heard the car slow on the street outside. She didn't stop what she was doing. Slowing cars weren't her concern. But then it stopped completely. She heard a door, then another. Ma'am. She finished what she was doing before sliding out from under the truck. She took her time. Not to make a point, just because she had learned a long time ago that reacting to an uncertain sound without completing the task in front of you was how people got hurt. When she stood up and turned around, wiping her hands on a shop rag, there were 2 officers at the end of her driveway. One was young, mid-20s maybe, with the kind of posture that came from 6 months on the job rather than 6 years. The other was older, late 40s, the kind of face that had made up its mind about most things before walking into the room. "Can I help you?" Nora said. "We got a report," the older one said. He was reading something on a small notepad, though he hadn't looked at it since she'd turned around. Theater. "Suspicious activity at this address. You live here?" "I do." "You own this property?" "I rent it. 3-year lease. Is there a problem?" The older officer, his nameplate read Rourke, looked at the garage, looked at the truck, looked at her hands, looked at her face. She could read the sequence of conclusions he was drawing as clearly as if he were printing them on a sign. The neighborhood was mostly owner-occupied. The houses were modest but kept. She was black, and she was not what he'd expected to find. "You got ID?" he said. She didn't show any reaction. "Sure." She set the shop rag on the truck bed and walked to the work table against the left wall where her keys, phone, and wallet sat in the same spot they always sat. She pulled out her wallet and handed him her driver's license. He looked at it longer than was necessary. Nora Voss. That's right. This says address in Clarksburg. I updated my registration with the county. The license is due for renewal in 6 months. I've been here 3 years, officer. The young one, Tillman, his plate said, was looking at the truck. She could see he was interested in it, maybe even impressed, which was a different energy than his partner's. Rourke handed the license back. What's your occupation? I'm a nurse at Briar Ridge Regional. Day shift starts at 7. That right. He said it like he was trying out the words to see if they fit. You know who called this in? Complaint said someone was operating an unlicensed mechanic shop at this address. Commercial activity in a residential zone. Nora looked at him. I'm working on my own vehicle. In my own garage. At 5:15 in the morning. That's a complaint? We respond to complaints, ma'am. Okay, she said. Then you've responded. I'm not running a shop. I'm rebuilding a truck I own. I've been doing it for 8 months. Is there anything else? Rourke didn't move. His hand was resting on his belt. Not the holster, just the belt. But it was still a statement. You got any documentation for the vehicle? She went back to the work table, pulled the registration and title from the folder she kept in the second drawer, because she kept documents in organized places and always had, and handed them over. He looked at them. Tillman said quietly, Looks right, Dale. Rourke didn't respond to that. You got anything else on this property? Tools seem like a lot for a personal project. Nora looked at the tools, then back at him. They're tools, she said. Where'd you get them? I bought them. You got receipts? She felt something shift in her chest, not anger exactly. It was older than anger. It was the specific, exhausting recognition of a performance she'd seen before. The questions that weren't really questions, the requests that weren't really requests, the slow escalation designed to produce either compliance or reaction, and either one would be used against her. She had learned, a long time ago, how to not give them the reaction. Officer Rourke, she said, I've answered your questions. I've provided my ID, my registration, and my title. I'm not running a business. I have a shift at the hospital in under 2 hours. If you have an actual concern, I'm happy to hear it. If not, I need to get cleaned up. Rourke looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Tillman, then back at her. Stay here, he said, and went back to the patrol car. Tillman stayed. He was looking at the truck again. That a 79? He asked, quietly, like he wasn't sure he was allowed. 78, actually. The grille and rear panel are from a 79. Previous owner swapped them. He nodded. My uncle had one of those. She didn't answer. Not because she was being hostile, she just didn't know where that sentence was supposed to go, and filling silence for its own sake was something she'd stopped doing around the same time she'd stopped expecting comfort from strangers. Rourke came back from the car walking differently, shoulders higher. That was the tell. Something had changed. Need you to step away from the vehicle, he said. Nora didn't move immediately. Why? We're going to have a look around. You don't have my consent to search, and you haven't stated probable cause. I've stated a complaint. A complaint isn't probable cause. Rourke's jaw moved. Not speech, just movement. Ma'am, I need you to step away from the vehicle and keep your hands visible. My hands are visible. She held them up, palms out. Shop rag was still in her left hand. I'm standing here. I'm not going anywhere. But I'm also not consenting to a search, and I'd like to know the basis for this escalation. Escalation, Rourke repeated. He said it like the word itself was the problem. Lady, I'm asking you to cooperate. I have cooperated. Completely. Tillman said something under his breath. She didn't catch it. What happened next happened in about 4 seconds. Rourke reached for her arm. She didn't pull away. She was trained not to pull away because pulling away gave them the next step. But she turned her body slightly, just enough that his grip didn't land the way he'd intended, and he overcorrected, and his other hand came up and hit the work table and knocked her wallet to the floor. The wallet landed open. Her cards fanned out across the concrete. And there, face up under the fluorescent light, was the laminated card she kept out of habit rather than necessity. Matte gray. Small block text. The kind of formatting that didn't come from a print shop. Rourke picked it up. He looked at it for a moment, then at her, then back at it. She watched his face do something she recognized. Not quite fear, more like the recalibration that happens when a person realizes the map they've been using doesn't match the territory. He held it up. "What is this?" "Medical credentials," she said. "Federal level clearance, if you want to be precise about it." "This is military." It was. Tillman had walked over and was looking at it too. His expression was different from Rourke's. He looked like someone who'd just realized he was standing on the wrong side of something. "This says Department of Defense," Tillman said. "Yes." Rourke's grip on the card tightened. "Where'd you get this? These can be faked." Nora felt the temperature in her chest drop to something very specific and very still. "Officer, that credential carries a federal seal and a verification code. If you want to call it in, you're welcome to, but I'd ask you to handle it carefully." What Rourke did next would become the detail that appeared in every report, every deposition, every news brief for months afterward. He bent the card. Not completely in half, but enough. The laminate stressed. A small crack appeared along the lower left corner. "You're detaining yourself," he said, and those words didn't even make grammatical sense, which was maybe the most telling thing about the state of his thinking. "Turn around." "Officer, turn around." Nora turned around. She felt the cuffs close around her wrists. She stayed steady. She breathed. She thought about the 17 ways this situation could develop, ranked them by likelihood, and identified which one she was going to pursue. The one she was going to pursue required exactly one phone call. Tillman said, very quietly and very carefully, "Dale, the card looks real." "She's coming in," Rourke said. "Call it suspicious conduct, uncooperative, resisting." She didn't resist. "Tillman." Silence. The patrol car was gray and smelled like pine air freshener covering something worse. Nora sat in the back with her hands behind her and watched Caldecott Lane slide past the window. Mrs. Okafor's house. The flickering porch light. The corner where kids had spray-painted something on the stop sign that the city had painted over 3 times. She'd fixed a ceiling fan in Mrs. Okafor's living room 2 winters ago after the woman had mentioned offhandedly that she couldn't reach it and her nephew lived 4 hours away. She had not been asked. She'd just shown up the next Saturday morning with a ladder. That was the kind of neighborhood this was. That was the kind of person she was trying to be here. She pressed her back teeth together once, let the breath out slow, and started thinking forward. The Kellerton police station was a beige building on Alderman Street with a parking lot that needed resurfacing and a flag out front that had faded from red to a pale salmon color. She'd driven past it maybe 100 times without ever expecting to see its inside. She was processed without ceremony. Fingerprints, photo. They took her wallet, her phone, the shop rag, and the keys from her pocket. The credentials card, she noticed, had been bagged separately. A desk officer named Harlan, she could read his plate when he turned to log the evidence bag, looked at the card for a moment longer than everything else. He didn't say anything, but he logged it with a slight hesitation she filed away. Rourke filled out his report at a desk in the open bullpen. He was talking to another officer, a woman with a sergeant's stripe, who was listening with her arms crossed and an expression that said she was already calculating where this was going to land. Nora was put in a holding room, not a cell, which was a small distinction. Metal chair, metal table, greenish light. The kind of room that was designed to make time feel longer. She sat down and started counting the holes in the ceiling tiles. Not because she'd lost her mind, because counting things was a focusing technique she'd learned from a combat medic named Torres during her 3rd year of service, when the waiting before an operation had become almost physically painful. You count. You organize. You prepare. After 41 minutes by the wall clock, the door opened. It was Tillman. He looked like someone had aged him slightly since she'd last seen him. He set a cup of water on the table without being asked and sat down across from her. He had a notepad but didn't open it. I need to ask you some questions, he said. Okay. Can you tell me more about the credential, the card Officer Rourke? He paused. The card that was in your wallet. What do you want to know? Were you military? Yes. What branch? She looked at him. He was trying. She could see that much. It didn't change what she was going to say, but she noticed it. I'd rather not discuss the specifics. There's a verification number on that credential. If you run it through the right channel, you'll get the information you need. What channel? There's a number printed along the bottom edge, below the seal. It's a federal line. Tillman wrote something down. The card looked damaged. Officer Rourke bent it. He stopped writing. I said he bent it, Nora repeated calmly. The laminate cracked. I don't know if the embedded information was compromised, which is a problem because that card is federal property, and damaging it carries specific consequences. Tillman looked at the notepad, then at the table, then at her. You're not what I expected, he said. It came out like he hadn't meant to say it out loud. She didn't know what to do with that, so she didn't respond. We have to keep you here while we verify, he said. I want you to know I'm going to run the number. I know you are, she said. He left. The next 2 hours were the kind of slow that has weight. She didn't ask for a phone call immediately. She was calculating timing, the same way she'd always calculated timing. Too early, and the response would be chaotic. Too late, and the evidence trail would shift. The door opened twice in that window. Once for a female officer who checked on her without speaking. Once for Harlan, from processing, who looked at her like he was trying to solve a problem she was the center of. She heard voices through the wall at different points. At one point, raised. She couldn't make out the words, but she recognized the shape of an argument between someone with authority and someone who thought they had more of it. At the 2-hour mark, she asked the female officer for her phone call. She was given it. She did not call a lawyer. She did not call family. There was no family worth calling, not because she was estranged, but because the people she was closest to in this world were distributed across 3 different clearance levels and 2 time zones. She called a number she had memorized in the same way she had memorized anatomy, completely and without ever intending to forget. It rang twice. Voss! The voice on the other end was immediate and flat. Not unkind, just efficient. It was the voice of someone who'd been waiting to be needed. It's me, she said. I've been detained. Kellerton. Alderman Street. A pause, 3 seconds maybe. How long? 2 hours? 11 minutes. Status? Physically fine. They have the card. It's been damaged. Another pause. This one felt different. Damaged how? Bent. Laminate cracked. A sound that was not quite a sigh. Okay, stand by. I know, she said. She handed the phone back to the officer. She sat back down. She waited. The thing about waiting, when you had been trained to wait under conditions that were genuinely life or death, was that an uncomfortable metal chair in a Kellerton holding room barely registered. She was not anxious. She was not afraid. She was in the exact way she had learned to be in the quiet before things changed, simply ready. She heard the sound before she could identify its source. It was not loud. In fact, it was almost the opposite. A low organizational shift, the sound of people moving with precision and without hesitation. She had heard that particular sound in forward operating bases and field hospitals, and exactly once in a government building in Washington where she had spent 4 hours testifying about something she was still not permitted to describe. Through the narrow window in the door, she saw light change. A door opened somewhere outside. Then another. Voices, but not raised, controlled. The specific register of authority that doesn't need volume, because volume is for people who aren't sure they have power. The holding room door opened. The officer who had been guarding the hallway outside was not there anymore. A woman in civilian clothes stood in the doorway. Behind her, visible through the gap, were 2 men in dark clothing with no insignia. The kind of absence of insignia that was its own statement. The woman's name would eventually appear in several reports, but in that moment she simply held the door open and said, without preamble, without warmth, and without any uncertainty, Sergeant Voss, you're cleared to leave. Nora stood up. Your property is being cataloged, the woman continued. The damaged credential has been flagged for processing. You'll be asked to provide a statement, but not tonight and not here. From down the hallway came the sound of Officer Dale Rourke's voice, not screaming, but close. The sound of a man who had just understood, badly and too late, the dimension of what he'd done. Nora walked out of the holding room. She stood in the hallway for a moment, looking at the fluorescent lights and the linoleum floor and the beige walls with their outdated bulletin board notices. She had spent 11 years in the kind of service that doesn't appear on public records. She had left that service because she wanted something smaller and quieter. She had come to Kellerton. She had fixed Mrs. Okafor's ceiling fan and rebuilt an engine and shown up for 7 o'clock shifts without complaint or vanity. She had thought, in some practical and unsentimental part of herself, that she could simply be ordinary. She pulled her sleeve down over her left wrist. The metal had left a mark. Not serious, she'd had worse from instrument trays, but real. Down the corridor, the sound of Rourke's voice had been replaced by something like silence, and in that silence was the very specific quality of a man being told something that was rearranging everything he thought he'd known about the morning. Nora started walking. The case file on Dale Rourke, she would later learn, had been opened before she reached the exit door. The exit door swung shut behind her with a sound like a period at the end of a sentence. The parking lot of the Kellerton Police Department was cold, in the way that early mornings in West Virginia could be, not brutal, just indifferent, the kind of cold that didn't care whether you were wearing a jacket or not. Nora stood on the sidewalk and let it hit her face for a moment. She needed the shock of it, not to feel something, but to stop feeling too much of the wrong things. The woman in civilian clothes, she'd introduced herself only as feral, no rank, no agency, which told Nora exactly what she needed to know, stood beside her with a tablet in one hand and a phone in the other. "We have a vehicle," Farrell said. "I need to get back to my house first." Farrell looked up from the tablet. "Sergeant, my shift starts at 7. Nora glanced at the sky, pale gray going pink at the eastern edge. "Maybe 5:40. And I'd like to change clothes before I walk into the hospital smelling like that holding room." A pause. Farrell had the kind of face that made decisions without consulting its expression. 15 minutes at the residence, then we need your statement before noon." "Understood." The vehicle was a dark green SUV that had government plates and could have belonged to anyone with enough imagination. One of the two men she'd seen in the hallway was driving. The other sat in the front passenger seat and hadn't looked at her since she'd gotten in, which was either professional discipline or personal avoidance. Either way, she didn't press it. They pulled onto Alderman Street and headed north. Through the rear window, she could see the station. There was a second unmarked vehicle in the lot now that hadn't been there before, and someone in a suit was standing on the front steps talking to a uniformed officer who had the body language of someone being informed their vacation was canceled. Rourke was not visible. She noted the absence. Caldecott Lane looked the same as she'd left it. That was the thing about serious mornings. They didn't rearrange the furniture. The garage door was still open. The truck was on the lift where she'd left it. The shop rag was on the ground near the rear wheel where it had fallen when everything began. She went inside, showered in 6 minutes, changed into her work clothes, and stood for a moment in the kitchen looking at the still half-full coffee mug she'd left on the counter before the shift on the Planet had tilted. She poured it out, made a fresh cup, drank half of it standing over the sink. Then she picked up her bag and went back out to the car. Farrell was on a call when she got in. Not arguing, just receiving. Her face did something very small, a compression around the eyes. And she ended the call and looked at Nora directly for the first time since the station. "There's a complication," she said. "Oh, what kind?" The credential verification triggered a flag. Standard protocol when a DOD credential is physically compromised. She set the tablet on her knee. That flag went to 3 offices simultaneously. One of them is asking for an interagency briefing before we proceed. How long does that take? Depends on who shows up and whether they're going to compete with each other or cooperate. Farrell said it without inflection, but Nora had been around enough institutional bureaucracy to hear the history in that sentence. Could be 4 hours. Could be 2 days. I have patients today. I understand that. No. Nora kept her voice level. I don't mean it as a complaint. I mean it as a logistical statement. There are people whose continuity of care runs through me. I need someone to call the charge nurse at Briar Ridge and explain that I won't be there without specifying why. Farrell looked at her for a moment. I can make that call. Don't tell them anything about this morning. What should I tell them? Family emergency, Nora said, short and vague. Farrell nodded and picked up her phone. Nora looked out the window and watched Caldecott Lane scroll past as they pulled away again. Mrs. Okafor's porch light was off now. The sky was getting lighter by degrees, the kind of morning light that promised nothing about the day. She had worked at Briar Ridge Regional for 3 years without incident, without standing out, without being remarkable, without drawing the kind of attention that would require her to explain herself. She had been competent and present and unassuming, and she had taken genuine satisfaction in that. There was a kind of skill, she had always believed, in being exactly as much as the situation required and no more. She wondered, in a flat and unsentimental way, how much of that was now finished. The interagency briefing happened in a conference room at a federal field office in Morgantown that she'd been driven to without announcement. It took 2.5 hours, most of which she spent in a waiting area with a water cooler and a framed print of a West Virginia landscape that was either Mount Port or a stock photo pretending to be. 3 different men came to speak to her at separate intervals. All 3 were polite. All 3 asked some version of the same questions. She answered each one the same way, concisely, accurately, without volunteering anything they hadn't asked for. The 3rd man was older and had the specific kind of tiredness that comes not from lack of sleep, but from too many years of knowing things he couldn't discuss at dinner. We're going to need the incident documented formally, he said. I know. Sergeant Voss, Nora is fine. I've been out for 3 years. He acknowledged that with a small nod. Nora, the credential that was damaged, you understand the implications of that going through normal processing? I do. It's going to attract attention, not just to Rourke, to the department, to how the situation was initiated. Good, she said. He paused. That's your position. My position is that a man used a badge to do something he shouldn't have done, and I'd like it to be on record. The rest of the implications aren't my responsibility to manage. He looked at her for a moment. He had gray eyes behind frameless glasses and the air of someone who'd spent decades mediating between what was right and what was convenient. You could have made this quieter, he said. It was not quite an accusation. I could have, she agreed. I chose not to. He left. Farrell came back 20 minutes later and told her she could go, that the formal statement could be given the following morning, and that in the meantime someone from the field office would be in contact with the Kellerton PD regarding access to evidence, specifically Rourke's body camera footage. Nora had not known there was body camera footage until that sentence. She filed that away. She was returned to Kellerton by mid-afternoon, taken back to Caldecott Lane in the same green SUV with the same silent driver. She got out, stood on the driveway. The garage was still open. She went inside and lowered the truck off the lift, then stood looking at it for a few minutes. Not working, just looking. She went inside and called Briar Ridge. Priya answered at the nursing station. Hey, Nora said. Hey yourself, are you okay? The charge nurse said family emergency. I'm fine. I'll be back tomorrow. Okay. A pause. You don't sound fine. I'm fine. You sound like you do when Mr. Petrakis in 4C is being difficult and you're pretending it's not affecting you. Nora surprised herself by almost laughing. Not quite, but close. I'll be back tomorrow, she said again, and she could hear Priya deciding not to push, which was one of the things she genuinely liked about her. She made dinner, ate half of it, and went to bed at 9 o'clock. She did not sleep well. It wasn't anxiety exactly. It was the particular alertness of someone waiting for the other shoe, trained to that anticipation so thoroughly that even 3 years of ordinary living hadn't smoothed it out. She'd wake at intervals, check the window, check the clock. At 2:15, she gave up and made tea and sat at the kitchen table and wrote out, by hand, everything she could recall about the morning in sequence, in the flat clinical language she'd learned to use for field incident reports. She sealed it in an envelope and put it in the kitchen drawer under the measuring tape. She gave her formal statement at 8 the next morning in the same Morgantown field office, to a woman named Vasquez who took notes by hand and asked follow-up questions that told Nora she'd already read everything Farrell had compiled. The deposition took an hour and 40 minutes. Vasquez thanked her in the way that meant there would be more to come. Nora went to work. She was an hour late arriving at Briar Ridge, which she'd called ahead about. The charge nurse, Donna, looked at her the way people look at someone they're worried about but don't know how to ask. Nora gave her a short, factual version, personal situation, being addressed. And Donna nodded with the practiced grace of a woman who'd been managing a hospital floor for 18 years and knew when not to dig. The shift was busy. Not crisis level, but consistent. The kind of morning where the bed stayed full and the call's light stayed lit and the work moved through her without requiring the part of her brain she'd spent the previous 36 hours running at full capacity. She did 4 wound assessments, redressed a surgical site on a patient who'd been picking at the edges, managed a blood pressure situation in the annex that had resolved by the time the attending got there, and spent 40 minutes with an older man named Harold who'd had a hip replacement and was terrified about the PT and just needed someone to sit with him while the fear ran through. She sat with him. She was not a perfect nurse. She was sometimes too direct in ways that unsettled patients who wanted softness. She had been told, at least twice, that her bedside manner could use work, which she accepted as fair. But she was present, and she was honest, and in the 2.5 hours she'd given Harold, she'd talked him from a flat-out refusal of physical therapy to a tentative agreement to try the first session. That felt like the only uncomplicated thing that had happened in 2 days. On her break, she stepped outside to the small concrete area behind the loading dock where some of the staff smoked and the rest just needed a minute. She didn't smoke. She stood against the wall and looked at the sky. Spencer, the overnight orderly, was sitting on a crate eating a sandwich. He was still here, which meant he'd pulled a double. "You look like you didn't sleep," he said. "I didn't?" He nodded like that was a reasonable thing to admit. Spencer was 23 and had the kind of undemanding company that she'd come to value without ever consciously deciding to. He didn't require her to be more or less than she was. "There was a police car out front this morning," he said, parked, for a while. She looked at him. "When?" "Like 6:30, before you got here." He peeled the crust off his sandwich with the focus of someone who had very strong opinions about bread. "I figured it was something with one of the patients in 2A. That family's been tense." She filed it. "Probably." She went back inside. The police car was a concern, not an emergency, but she'd learned, the hard way, and in circumstances that were substantially higher stakes than this one, that things that appeared in your peripheral vision for no obvious reason generally had a reason. She texted Farrell the moment she was on a break. "Vehicle outside Briar Ridge this morning, pre-shift. Any connection to the case?" The response came 47 minutes later. "Checking. Don't engage." She hadn't intended to engage. She put the phone in her scrub pocket and went back to Harold. The second police car appeared the following morning. This one she saw herself. Same spot. The curved driveway in front of the main entrance, pulled up far enough to watch the employee lot, but positioned to be deniable about it. A different car from the first. She clocked the plate number without being obvious about it, the same way she'd once clocked exit routes in crowded rooms in other countries. She went inside, did her shift, documented the plate in a text to Farrell at noon. Farrell's response this time came in under 3 minutes. "That's Kellerton PD, not sanctioned. Do not approach." Nora sat with that for a moment in the break room. Not sanctioned meant someone had sent that car on their own initiative outside the official review process, without authorization from whoever was currently overseeing the Rourke situation. That meant someone in the department was worried enough about what was coming to be doing unauthorized surveillance on a federal witness before the formal investigation had even been filed. She texted back. "Understood. Logging time and plate for record." She did not feel afraid. She felt something more specific. The acute functional awareness of someone who has correctly identified the nature of an incoming problem and is now operating in the gap between when you know something is coming and when it arrives. She called Farrell that evening from her kitchen. "They're watching me," she said. Not a question. "We believe it's Rourke's partner," Farrell said. "Sergeant named Grady Pullum. He's not officially under review yet, but the body camera footage has created some issues for a few people beyond Rourke. What kind of issues? The kind that make people take unauthorized actions. Nora stood at her kitchen window. Caldecott Lane was quiet. The Kowalski house light was still flickering. How bad is the footage? Worse than Rourke probably thinks, Farrell said. He doesn't have the most self-awareness about how he presents on camera. What he said in that garage, what he said at the station, there are 6 people in that department whose names appear in the timestamp record for that shift. 6. She absorbed that. Not just Rourke. Not just Rourke. She looked at the kitchen drawer where the envelope was. What happens next? The formal complaint is filed tomorrow. That triggers the external review. After that, it's not mine to control. But someone tipped off Pullum that the complaint was coming. A pause. Brief, but real. Yes. So there's a leak in the process. We're addressing it. Nora pulled the window curtain aside an inch and looked down the street. A car she didn't recognize was parked 3 houses down, facing toward her house. It had been there for 40 minutes. She'd noticed it on her way home, but hadn't reacted. There's a vehicle on my street, she said. She heard Farrell do something on the other end. Fingers on a keyboard, maybe. How long? Going on an hour, it hasn't moved. License plate? Far enough that I can't get it without being obvious. Okay, don't go outside. Do you have... Farrell stopped herself. I'm fine, Nora said. It was the same 2 words she'd said to Priya, but they had different weight this time. More weight. The kind of weight that comes not from reassurance, but from fact. She had been in situations, in the years before Kellerton, where the person watching from a car had bad intentions and the tools to act on them. She had learned, in those years, a set of responses that were effective and proportionate, and that she had genuinely hoped never to need again. She was doing a quiet running assessment of her house's layout, its exits, its sight lines, and the location of 2 specific items she kept for reasons she didn't explain to anyone. I'll have someone on your street within 15 minutes, Farrell said. I know, Nora said. She put the phone down on the counter and stood in the dark kitchen and watched the car through the gap in the curtain. It didn't move. 11 minutes later, a second car turned onto Caldecott Lane from the south end. It drove slowly. The car 3 houses down turned its headlights on, pulled forward 3 feet, then stopped. She could not see the driver at this distance, but she watched the 2 vehicles exist in each other's presence for a long moment. The tension of proximity, both of them deciding something. Then the car turned off its lights and drove away, heading north. She let the curtain fall. She stood in the kitchen for another minute, just breathing, not managing fear. She didn't have much of it, and that was not a brag but a specific kind of damage and training she'd stopped analyzing years ago. Just breathing, returning to baseline. Her phone buzzed. It was not Farrell. It was a number she didn't recognize, local area code. She didn't answer. It went to voicemail. She waited. The voicemail notification appeared. She played it. A man's voice. She didn't recognize it immediately, but she recognized the type, the artificial steadiness of someone who'd rehearsed what they were going to say enough that the rehearsal was visible. Ms. Voss, my name isn't important. I just want you to know that whatever you think you're doing, you're only going to make things worse for yourself. The department takes care of its own. That doesn't have to include you, but you're making choices right now that might change that. A pause. The kind of pause where someone wanted you to feel the threat sitting in the silence. Think about it. She stood holding the phone. Then she dialed Farrell. I just received a call from an unknown number, she said when Farrell picked up on the second ring. I have the voicemail. You're going to want it. Farrell's voice changed in a way that was very small but unmistakable, tighter, more immediate. Play it for me. Nora played it. When it ended, there was a silence of maybe 3 seconds. Don't delete it, Farrell said. And Nora, lock your doors. They were already locked, she said, and she was surprised to find, underneath the fatigue and the long calculus of threat assessment, something that felt almost like clarity, because whoever had made that call had just crossed a line. They had moved from watching to acting. They had put a voice on record doing something that would look, to any investigator, like witness intimidation. They had thought they were applying pressure. What they had actually done was hand her a weapon. The formal complaint hit the Kellerton Police Department at 9:14 the following morning, and by noon, 3 separate vehicles with federal plates were parked outside the station on Alderman Street, and the police chief, a man named Holt, who had been in the job for 11 years and had the specific pallor of someone watching a building fall, had canceled every interview scheduled for the week. Nora heard this secondhand from Farrell. She was at work when it happened. She was checking a medication chart, actually, standing at the nurse's station with a ballpoint pen she'd borrowed from Donna and a cup of cold coffee she kept meaning to finish. Spencer walked past and told her there was someone asking for her at the front desk, and she looked up and thought for a half second about the car that had been parked on her street and the voice on the voicemail. Then Spencer added, "Guy in a suit, says he's from the state attorney's office." She put the pen down. She put the coffee down. She walked to the front desk. The man was mid-40s, with the kind of shoes that said he drove to work and the kind of eyes that said he'd been in a courthouse long enough to stop being impressed by anything. He held out a card. She read it. His name was Denton Farrar, and his title confirmed what Spencer had said. "Ms. Voss," he said. "I was hoping for a few minutes. I'm on shift." "I know. I'll be brief." He glanced at the lobby. A woman with 2 children, an older man in a wheelchair waiting for transport. Somewhere private would be better. She took him to the small family consultation room off the main corridor. She stood. He sat, then seemed to reconsider and stood as well, which she appreciated for reasons she didn't examine. "We've been contacted by the federal field office in Morgantown regarding the incident on Caldecott Lane," he said. "We're being asked to coordinate on the complaint. The state attorney has jurisdiction over the civil rights component, depending on how the federal review proceeds." "Okay," she said. "I'm here because there's a timeline issue." He set a file on the small table between them. "The voicemail you reported last night." "Yes." "We traced the number in under 4 hours. It was placed from a cell phone registered to a Grady Pullum, badge number 4471, Kellerton PD." She looked at him. "He appears to have called from his personal device," Denton said, "which is either arrogant or panicked or both. Our office is moving to include him in the investigation." He paused. "I wanted to tell you in person because what happens next is going to move quickly, and you're at the center of it. You'll hear things about the department, about what the body cam footage shows, about some of the other officers involved, and some of it is going to be worse than what you already know." She waited. "The footage shows Rourke at the station the morning you were brought in," Denton said. "He made some statements to colleagues about you in front of other officers. It's—" He stopped. Chose the next word carefully. "It's documented. And combined with the credential damage and now Pullum's call, we're looking at a pattern, not an isolated incident." Nora kept her face still. She'd learned to do that not to be hard but to stay useful. If you let the emotion cross your face in the moment, you lost the room. "What happens next?" she said. "Next we get a circuit court date. Probably 3 weeks, given the federal involvement forcing the timeline." He looked at her steadily. "What happens to Rourke and Pullum at that point depends on what the body cam shows and what witnesses will say." "Tillman," she said. Something shifted in Denton's expression. "Yes. Officer Tillman has already been interviewed." She thought about the young officer in her garage with his questions about the truck, the way he'd said Dale. The card looks real. The way he'd sat across from her in the holding room trying to figure out which side of the line he was on. "What did he say?" she asked. "He confirmed everything in your account," Denton said. "In full. It cost him something to do it." She looked at the family consultation room wall. Pale yellow, a watercolor print of a mountain, a box of tissues on the windowsill that was running low and hadn't been replaced. "I know," she said. She went back to her shift. She had 6 hours left in the day, and she worked all of them. She didn't think about the circuit court date or the body cam footage or Grady Pullum's car on her street. She did her job. She checked charts and changed dressings and had 2 separate conversations with attending physicians about patient decisions she disagreed with, and was right about one of them and wrong about the other, and she tried to remember both with the same evenness. At the end of the shift, she sat in the locker room and changed out of her scrubs and sat for a moment with her bag on her knee. Priya came in from the far end, pulling her lanyard over her head. She stopped when she saw Nora's face. "What happened?" she said. "Long few days." Priya sat down on the bench across from her. She didn't say anything right away. That was the thing about her. She knew when a question was useful and when it wasn't. "My neighbor thinks I run a mechanic shop," Nora said finally. "Filed a complaint with the police." Priya blinked. "That started this?" "That started this." "Who's your neighbor?" "Doesn't matter." Priya was quiet for another moment. "You're going to be okay," she said. Not a question. Not even reassurance exactly. More like a statement of observed fact from someone who'd been watching closely enough to have an opinion. Nora picked up her bag. "I know," she said, and she walked out into the parking lot where the evening was coming down blue and cold over Kellerton, and her car was where she'd left it, and 3 rows away, under a light that was about to flicker out, was a white sedan she did not recognize and which was empty, but which had been backed into the spot, always a tell, and which had mud on the rear wheel, well, that was the wrong color for this part of town. She stood there in the cold for a moment. Then she took out her phone and photographed the plate. She sent it to Farrell, and then she walked to her own car, got in, and drove home, because there was nothing else to do at the end of a long day but get up and drive toward whatever was coming. The response from Farrell arrived before she reached Caldecott Lane. "That vehicle is registered to an individual with prior connections to Rourke. Currently under secondary review. Do not return to it. We have the image." She parked in her driveway and sat for a moment in the car. Through the garage window, she could see the shape of the truck on the lift, suspended there in the dark. She had come to Kellerton to be left alone. She had chosen quiet. She had built, slowly and without ceremony, something that resembled a life. Whatever Rourke and Pullum and whoever was driving that white sedan thought they were doing, whatever they thought they were managing or controlling or shutting down, they had no idea what they had put in motion the morning they'd put cuffs on someone and assumed the cuffs were the end of the story. She got out of the car. She went inside. The kitchen drawer was still closed, the envelope still in it, and somewhere across town she knew, without needing to verify, a man named Grady Pullum was beginning to understand that the call he'd made from his personal cell phone was the last in a long chain of decisions that had just run out of road. The circuit court date came in at 2.5 weeks, not 3. Farrell called on a Tuesday morning while Nora was in the hospital parking lot eating half a granola bar before her shift, which was the closest she'd gotten to breakfast in 4 days. The hearing was scheduled for a Thursday, 11 days out, in the Alderman County Circuit Court on Grover Street. The Federal Review had formally merged with the state attorney's civil rights complaint, which meant Denton, Farrar, and Farrell's office were now working the same file from different directions. "Pullum's been placed on administrative leave," Farrell said. "Rourke's suspension was already in place. Both of them have retained private counsel." "Who's representing Rourke?" "A firm out of Charleston, Kessler and Mott. They do a lot of law enforcement defense." Nora finished the granola bar and folded the wrapper into a small square. "That's a serious firm for a patrol officer." "Someone's paying for it." She didn't ask who. She could think of 2 or 3 structures: union funds, a department discretionary account, a private donor with a reason to keep Rourke from cooperating, and none of them would surprise her. "What do I need to do before Thursday?" she said. "Review your statement. Vasquez will want a follow-up session tomorrow to prep your testimony, and I'd strongly suggest you don't talk to anyone at Kellerton PD between now and then, not even Tillman. He's been cooperating." "I know, but optics matter right now." She got out of the car and walked toward the hospital entrance. "Farrell, how bad is the body cam?" A pause. "It's bad for at least 4 people." 4. Rourke's camera picked up parts of 2 conversations he had at the station after you were processed. One of them involves a lieutenant. Nora stopped walking. "A lieutenant was in the building when I was there?" "Briefly. He didn't interact with you directly, but he was aware of the situation, and he made a comment on camera, that is." Farrell paused again, and she had the sense of someone choosing words with the care of someone diffusing something. "It's going to be in the record." Nora started walking again. "Okay," she said. "Okay," Farrell said, and hung up. The hospital was busy in the way it always was on weekday mornings. A controlled chaos with its own rhythm, carts moving and lights blinking and voices layered over each other in the hallways. She put on her badge at the nurse's station and picked up her assignment sheet and stood for a moment reading it, letting the hospital's specific kind of noise settle her into the work. The prep session with Vasquez the next morning was 2 hours in the same Morgantown field office conference room. Vasquez was efficient and thorough, asking Nora to walk through the morning of the arrest in sequence, stopping her at specific points to ask about precise details, exact words used, order of events, physical positions, what she had and hadn't been told about her rights. Nora answered everything without embellishment. She had learned that the most damaging testimony was the flat kind, the kind where the speaker didn't seem to be trying to make a case, because juries and judges could always sense effort, and effort looked like motivation, and motivation created doubt about objectivity. "You're very composed about this," Vasquez said at one point. "Not a criticism, just an observation." "I know what happened," Nora said. "That makes it easier to talk about." "Most people who've been through something like this." "I'm not most people." She said it without heat. "I know how that sounds, but it's relevant. I've been through things that recalibrated my sense of what constitutes a threat. That morning in my garage was wrong, and it was deliberate, and I want it on record, but it didn't break something in me." She paused. "Rourke was counting on it, too." Vasquez wrote something down. "That's going in the file." "That's fine." She drove back to Kellerton with the windows down, even though it was cold enough to justify keeping them up. She needed the air moving. There was something about the compression of the past 2 weeks, the field office rooms, the procedural language, the careful management of information, that made the air feel thin. She had spent years in environments where the stakes were unambiguous, where the rules of engagement were clear if often brutal, and she had found it easier than this specific kind of institutional grinding, where everything was real, but nothing moved at the speed it should. She stopped at the gas station on Route 19 and put fuel in the car and stood in the cold for a moment looking at the mountains in the middle distance, the blue-gray shapes of them against a sky that couldn't decide between overcast and clear. She went home, made soup, went to bed early. She did not sleep. The Thursday of the hearing arrived gray and wet, the kind of November morning that was committed to being unpleasant. Nora wore a dark blazer over a white shirt, her hair back, no jewelry. She drove herself to the courthouse on Grover Street because she had declined the offer of a car, and because sitting in someone else's vehicle before a proceeding she needed to be sharp for would have made everything worse. The Alderman County Circuit Court was an older building, red brick with narrow windows, the kind of architecture that communicated authority through mass rather than elegance. The parking lot had too few spaces for the number of vehicles already there. She found a spot at the far end and walked in. The hallway outside the courtroom was crowded in a way she hadn't anticipated. Not the public exactly, courthouse visitors, lawyers, administrative staff, but among them she could pick out the specific configuration of federal presence, the slightly too ordinary clothing, the earpieces that were almost invisible, the positioning near exits and windows that civilians wouldn't think about, and that told her Farrell's office had sent more than an observer. Denton Farrer was near the courtroom door with a second attorney she didn't recognize, a younger woman with a leather satchel and the look of someone who'd spent the past 2 nights with documents rather than sleep. He saw Nora and nodded once. She nodded back. Rourke was 20 feet away. She hadn't expected that. She'd assumed he would already be inside or sequestered somewhere with his lawyers. But there he was, standing near the window with a man in his 50s who had the bearing of someone who billed by the hour and charged for the attitude. Rourke was wearing a suit that didn't quite fit across the shoulders, and his face had a quality she recognized. Not guilt, which would have been something, but the specific set of a person who had decided the problem was other people's perception rather than their own actions. He didn't look at her. She didn't try to make him. The hearing itself was preliminary. Not a full trial, but a formal evidentiary review before the circuit judge, a woman named Carla Mossbridge, who had short white hair and the manner of someone who'd stopped tolerating theater in approximately 2011. The purpose of the proceeding was to establish the scope of the investigation and to determine whether the evidence supported the civil rights and criminal charges that had been formally filed that week. Nora sat behind Denton at the plaintiff's table. She kept her hands on the table in front of her, not folded, not clasped, just resting. The charges against Rourke were read aloud: unlawful detention, civil rights violation under federal statute, destruction of government property, and intimidation of a federal credential holder. The charges against Pullum were read separately: witness intimidation, unauthorized use of police resources, and 2 counts she didn't catch immediately because the HVAC system in the courtroom made a sound at the wrong moment. Rourke's attorney, the man from Charleston, whose name turned out to be Mott, immediately moved to suppress the body camera evidence on technical grounds. Judge Mossbridge denied the motion in approximately 90 seconds, with the specific brevity of someone who had considered it in advance and found it without merit. Mott then made a second motion. He argued that the credential in question was not formally on record as Nora's property, and therefore its damage could not constitute destruction of federal property. That was when Farrell's representative, a man named Okafor, which was a coincidence so specific that Nora almost registered surprise, stood up and placed a document on the judge's bench. Nora watched Mossbridge read it. She watched the judge's expression do something very small and very significant. "Counselor," Mossbridge said, "are you aware that the credential in question is covered under Title 18, Section 1036, and that the individual holding it carries active reserve classification?" Mott said something about being prepared to address that claim. "You should be," Mossbridge said, and moved on. The phrase active reserve classification moved through the room in the way that certain pieces of information move, not loudly, but pervasively, spreading to everyone who needed to hear it and landing differently for each of them. Nora kept her hands flat on the table. She had not known, entirely, that her classification had been maintained on the reserve side. She'd known she was technically within the reserve structure. It was part of the separation agreement she'd signed, the terms of which she wasn't permitted to discuss in this setting. But she had not known, until Okafor placed that document on the judge's bench, that the classification had been specifically preserved in a way that strengthened the property charge from a misdemeanor to a federal felony. Rourke, she could see from the corner of her vision, had turned to Mott and was saying something very quickly and very quietly. Mott was not responding with reassurance. The body camera footage was admitted into evidence. The first segment played on a screen to the left of the judge's bench. There was no sound initially, a technical delay that lasted maybe 40 seconds while someone adjusted something. In that silence, the courtroom watched Dale Rourke on the morning of the incident in her garage with the silent, flat quality of security footage that doesn't care about anyone's version of events. When the sound came up, Nora heard her own voice for the first time from outside her own body. Calm, level. Stating the facts of her ownership and her occupation in that precise, slightly too measured tone she used when she was managing herself hard. Then Rourke's voice. Then the credential hitting the concrete because he'd bent it and dropped it and picked it up, and the microphone had caught the specific sound of the laminate cracking. Someone in the gallery made a sound. Mossbridge looked once in the direction of the gallery, and the room went quiet again. The second segment was from the station interior. Different camera angle, different light quality. Rourke talking to a woman in a sergeant's uniform. The same one Nora had seen through the glass wall of the bullpen, the one with her arms crossed. He was talking about Nora, using language that Nora had been told about in general terms, but was now hearing specifically, in a room with a federal recorder and a judge, and 24 people who were watching Mott's face go through several phases simultaneously. Then, in the background of the station footage, a man appeared who was not Rourke and not Pullum. He was in a lieutenant's uniform. He was walking through the background of the frame. He paused for a moment near Rourke, said something that was partially obscured by ambient noise, and then kept walking. Denton leaned over and said quietly, "That's Harwick, Lieutenant Carl Harwick." Nora looked at the frozen frame on the screen. The man in the background had the bearing of someone who was senior enough to stop something and had chosen not to. "He's not charged," Nora said. "Not yet," Denton said. Judge Mossbridge called a short recess. In the hallway, Nora went to the water fountain at the far end and drank from it for a moment, then stood up and looked at the window at the end of the hall and the gray morning outside it. The mountains were not visible from this angle, just sky and the tops of the buildings on Grover Street. Farrell materialized beside her with the specific quiet of someone who had spent a career moving without being heard. "How are you doing?" "Fine." "The Harwick development is new matters." "No," Farrell said. "It's not." They went back inside. The rest of the hearing proceeded with the methodical quality of institutional machinery that had finally found its footing. Tillman testified, not in full, this was preliminary, but enough to confirm the core sequence of events. He was careful and direct on the stand, and Nora could see him working to keep his voice even in the way people do when they've made a decision they know is going to cost them something and they've accepted it. But the cost is still real. He didn't look at her when he sat back down. That was fine. He didn't need to. At 4:12 in the afternoon, Judge Mossbridge ruled that the charges against Rourke would proceed to full trial, that Pullum would face a separate proceeding on the witness intimidation count, and that the matter of Lieutenant Harwick would be referred for investigation. She also made a brief statement, brief because she was not a theatrical woman, about the seriousness of the credential damage charge and its implications under federal law. Rourke's suit jacket across the shoulders was too tight when he stood, and Nora noticed that without meaning to and filed it away in the same place she filed everything she observed that she wasn't immediately sure what to do with. She was outside the courthouse by 4:30. The rain had stopped. The air smelled like wet pavement and something underneath it, something organic and cold from the mountains. She stood on the courthouse steps and let it hit her face, the same way she'd stood in the parking lot of the police station 11 days ago. Denton came out behind her. "That went about as well as we could have hoped," he said. "The Harwick footage," she said. "Did you know it was that clear?" "We knew he was in frame. We didn't know how close the audio would be." He stood beside her, looking at Grover Street, the traffic starting to build with the end of business day. His attorney is going to push hard for a cooperation deal. "He should have stopped it," she said. "Yes." He walked past her. She stopped, caught herself. Past Rourke. He heard what Rourke was saying. He kept walking. "I know." She didn't say anything else about it. She had, over the course of her adult life, learned to distinguish between the anger that was useful and the anger that was just pain looking for a direction, and she was running them through that filter now with the same efficiency she applied to everything else. Most of it came out as pain. She drove home through Kellerton in the early dark. The town looked the same as always. The gas stations and the fast food places and the side streets with their particular configurations of houses. She'd learned most of it in the 3 years she'd been here, the way she'd learned every environment she'd operated in. Not because she was paranoid, but because knowing the territory was how you stayed useful. She turned onto Caldecott Lane. Mrs. Okafor's porch light was on, steady tonight, no flickering. She was pulling into her driveway when her phone rang. It was not Farrell. It was not Denton. It was a number she recognized as Briar Ridge Regional, but the extension was the administrative wing, not the nursing floor. She answered. "Ms. Voss?" The voice was Deanna Holt, the hospital administrator, not the direct supervisor of the nursing floor. She was 2 levels above that. "I'm glad I caught you. Do you have a moment?" "Yes." "I wanted to reach out before you came in tomorrow. We've been made aware of the legal proceedings involving the Kellerton Police Department." A pause. "And we want to assure you that Briar Ridge's position is one of full support for our staff in matters like this." Nora waited. "We've also received a request," Holt continued, carefully, "from someone identifying themselves as an attorney representing a party in the proceeding, asking for your personnel file." The temperature of the moment shifted. "What was their name?" Nora said. "Mott. A Mr. Mott, from a firm in Charleston. Rourke's attorney, requesting her employment records." "What did you tell him?" Nora said. "We told him we'd need a court order," Holt said. "Standard policy, but I wanted you to know." "I appreciate that. Is there anything we can do on our end?" "Document the request and the response," Nora said. "Time and date. Keep a copy." "Already done." She thanked Holt and ended the call. She sat in the dark car in her driveway for a moment. Mott going after her employment record was standard defense strategy. try to establish inconsistency in her account, find something in her professional history that could be used to complicate her credibility, anything that made the plaintiff look like less of a clean surface. It was not surprising. It was, in fact, exactly what she would have expected a competent defense attorney to do. What was interesting was the timing. He'd called the hospital the same afternoon the body cam footage had played in the courtroom, which meant he'd watched the footage and decided his best available move was to find something about her that could muddy the water, which meant the footage was worse for Rourke than Mott had prepared for. She got out of the car and went inside. She was in the kitchen making tea when the message came through. Not to her phone, to the secure channel Farrell had set up, which she checked on a second device she kept on the kitchen counter. The message was brief and without preamble, which was always how Farrell communicated when the information was significant enough that she didn't want to spend words on framing. Harwick cooperating. Full statement provided this evening. Contents expand the scope beyond Rourke and Pullum. Briefing tomorrow morning, 0800. Dress for a longer day. Nora read it twice. Beyond Rourke and Pullum. She set the device down and looked at the kettle, which had begun to steam. She had understood from the beginning that what happened in her garage was not the act of one officer having a bad morning. She had understood it in the way you understand something when you have enough experience of systems and institutions to know that individual bad actors are rarely operating in isolation, that they exist inside structures that permit or encourage or simply fail to stop what they do. But understanding something abstractly was different from having a lieutenant hand it to investigators in a sworn statement on a Thursday evening. She poured the water into the mug. She was thinking about the bodies that would emerge from this, not physically, but institutionally. The people whose names would now appear in documents they hadn't expected to be in. The officers who'd heard Rourke talk in that bullpen and said nothing. The supervisor who'd looked at the credential bag and logged it with a hesitation she'd noticed and filed away. The kettle clicked off. Her phone buzzed on the counter, not the secure device, her regular phone. She looked at it. An unknown number, different area code from Pullum's call. She photographed the number before answering and sent it to Farrell's regular line, then answered. Ms. Voss. A woman's voice. Older. Not hostile. The opposite, actually. Careful. My name is Adrian Morrow. I'm a reporter with the West Virginia Chronicle. I've been covering the Kellerton PD case since yesterday's filing. Would you be willing to speak with me? Nora stood very still. How did you get this number? She said. A pause. I'm not able to share that. I'd like to give you the opportunity to tell your side before we publish. When do you publish? Sunday edition. 3 days. She did the math automatically. The trial was weeks out, the investigation ongoing, and a Sunday Chronicle story would hit before any of the formal proceedings could shape the narrative. I'm not able to comment on an active legal matter, Nora said. I understand. I just want you to know the story is being published with or without you. And some of what we've been told, the woman paused again. Some of what we've been told about your background is being framed in a way I'd want to verify directly. Nora put the mug down. What have you been told? She said. That the credential you were carrying was fraudulent, that you fabricated your military service record. A beat. That the federal involvement in this case is a personal favor from a former commanding officer who is, another pause, who is described by this source as someone with whom you have a personal relationship. The kitchen was very quiet. Someone had talked to the press. Someone with enough detail to construct a specific counter-narrative. Not random accusations, but targeted ones designed to reframe the entire case around her credibility. Fraudulent credentials, fabricated background, personal connection compromising the federal response. She knew with the specific certainty of someone who had been briefed on information warfare in contexts far more serious than a county courthouse, exactly what this was. Rourke's side wasn't just defending in court. They were running a parallel operation, and the reporter on her phone was the opening move of it. And Sunday was 3 days away. And Farrell's briefing was tomorrow morning at 8, and somewhere in a cooperation deal with a lieutenant named Harwick were facts that could either accelerate or be buried by what was about to run in print. She picked the mug back up. Miss Morrow, she said, I'm going to give you one piece of information on background, and then this call ends. Okay. Run the credential verification number yourself. It's a federal line. It's public access for credentialed press. You don't need a source for that." She paused. "What you find will tell you whether the source you've been speaking with is giving you facts or giving you a story." A long silence. "And if I run it," Morrow said, "then you'll know what you're publishing." She ended the call. She stood in the kitchen for a moment. The tea had gone to the temperature where it was drinkable but would cool fast. She picked it up and drank some of it and looked at the drawer where the envelope was still sitting, her handwritten account in its flat clinical language, sealed and waiting. She texted Farrell, Chronicle reporter, named source providing counter-narrative, fraudulent credential claim, directed her to the verification line. She put both phones down. She drank the rest of the tea. She had been in this place before. Not this kitchen, not this town, but this specific intersection of an institutional problem becoming public in ways that could not be fully controlled, where the outcome depended less on what had happened than on what could be proven, and proven fast enough to outrun the version being constructed by people who needed a different story to be true. She knew how to operate here. She was also, for the first time in 11 days, genuinely tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. She turned off the kitchen light. In the morning, she would be at Farrell's field office at 8, and the scope of this would be larger than she currently understood. And the Chronicle would call back before Sunday, and whatever Harwick had given them was already moving through the system toward a set of consequences that nobody, not Rourke, not Pullum, not the unnamed source who'd called a reporter, had accurately modeled when they'd decided that the woman in the garage wasn't someone who mattered. She walked down the dark hallway toward the bedroom. Her phone lit up on the kitchen counter behind her. It was Farrell. The message was 4 words, and she didn't see it until later, but when she did, she stood in the dark hallway for a long time reading it. Harwick named 6 more. 6 names. She read the message 4 more times, standing barefoot in the dark hallway, the kitchen light off behind her and the bedroom ahead. Not because she didn't understand it the first time, because she was building the shape of it, what 6 more names meant in terms of scope, structure, how far up this had actually gone, and whether Harwick had named them out of genuine remorse or out of the specific calculus of a man who had decided that the best way to protect himself was to make himself the least dangerous person in the room. She went back to the kitchen and turned the light on and texted Farrell, "Received. I'll be there at 7:30. Then she pulled the envelope out of the kitchen drawer and sat down at the table and opened it. Read her own handwriting. The flat, functional account of a morning that had taken less than 45 minutes to execute and had now apparently started pulling on a thread connected to 8 people's careers and the structural integrity of an entire department. She sat with that for a while. Not with satisfaction. She was honest enough with herself to know there was some of that, somewhere, and disciplined enough to not let it drive anything. Mostly she sat with the weight of it, the particular heaviness of a situation that had stopped being about her and had become something larger that she was now inside of, whether or not she'd chosen to be. She put the letter back in the envelope, went to bed, slept 4 hours, which was better than the past week's average. She was at the field office in Morgantown at 7:28. Farrell was already there, along with Vasquez, Denton, the younger attorney with the satchel whose name turned out to be Renato Say, and 2 men she hadn't seen before who had the specific combination of posture and restraint that told her they were federal and not state. The conference table had more documents on it than the last time. Someone had brought coffee, which was weak but present. Farrell did not waste time. Harwick's statement runs 42 pages. The 6 individuals he named are Sergeant Grady Pullum, already in our file, Captain Roy Ellman, commanding officer of the 3rd District, Lieutenant Carl Harwick himself. Yes, he included himself. Detective Warren Sims, Desk Officer Harlan Pruitt, and Chief Marcus Holt. The room was quiet in the way rooms get when a name lands differently than the ones before it. Chief Marcus Holt, the department's senior officer, the man who had been in the job 11 years. Denton said, "What's the nature of Holt's involvement?" Harwick states that Holt was informed about the detention within 90 minutes of Nora's arrest, not by Rourke, by Ellman. Holt made no move to intervene, made no contact with federal liaisons, and later, this is the significant part, Made a call to an individual Harwick identifies as a political contact, advising them that the credential issue was being handled internally and wouldn't need outside attention. Nora set her coffee down. He tried to manage it before it became a case. He tried to make sure it didn't become a case, Farrell said. Harwick has documentation, texts and a logged call from Holt's department-issued phone. Renata said, "That's obstruction." "That's the start of obstruction," Farrell said. "There's more." Harwick also states that the complaint that initiated the contact with Nora that morning, the noise complaint, the unlicensed mechanic call, was not a genuine civilian complaint. The room was quiet again. Nora looked at Farrell. "Say that again?" "There was no complaint," Farrell said. Or rather, a complaint was filed, but Harwick states it was filed internally, using a civilian routing number by someone within the department to generate a paper basis for the contact. She sat with that for a moment. The complaint that had sent Rourke to her driveway. The complaint she'd assumed was a neighbor with a grievance and a phone. Mrs. Okafor had told her, 2 days after the arrest, that she hadn't called anyone. Nora had assumed it was a different neighbor, one she didn't know well. It had been manufactured. "Who filed it?" she said. "Harwick doesn't know. He says Rourke mentioned it in passing, in a way that suggested Rourke knew the complaint was a formality rather than a real call. But the specific individual who generated the paperwork, we don't have that yet." "Pruitt," Nora said. Farrell looked at her. "Harlan Pruitt, the desk officer who logged my evidence the night I was processed. He hesitated when he logged the credential bag. I noticed it at the time." She paused. "He knew what it was because he'd already seen it. He helped generate the reason to go find it." Farrell and Vasquez exchanged a look. "That's an inference," Vasquez said carefully. "I know," Nora said. "Run his system access log for the morning of. If he generated the complaint, it came through a terminal." The two federal men who had not spoken since the meeting started were both writing now. Denton said, "If the complaint was manufactured, the entire legal basis for the initial contact is gone. Everything that followed is fruit of a poisoned tree." "Yes," Renata said, "and that changes the charge structure significantly. This isn't reckless conduct anymore. This is coordinated targeting." The word sat in the air above the conference table. Targeting. Nora knew what that word meant in legal terms. She also knew what it meant in the language she'd operated in before Kellerton. The deliberate selection of an individual as the subject of a directed action. She had thought, on the morning of the arrest, that she was dealing with bias, with a man who'd made assumptions and then defended them. She had not considered, in those first hours, that she might have been the specific object of something planned. She thought about the car parked 3 houses down. She thought about Pullum's voicemail. She thought about Mott calling Briar Ridge within hours of the body cam footage playing in court. She thought about how quickly Rourke had escalated in the garage, as if he'd already decided what the situation was before he arrived. "Who initiated it?" she said. "If Holt was managing the aftermath, who started the front end?" Farrell didn't answer immediately. "Farrell!" "We don't know yet," Farrell said. "Harwick doesn't name an originator. He may not know, or he may be withholding it as leverage." "Then that's what we need to find," Nora said, "because everything else, the charges, the trial, the investigation, that's process. But whoever decided to send Rourke to my driveway with a manufactured complaint is a different problem." She drove back to Kellerton. She had a shift at noon. She had 2 hours. She stopped at home and changed and stood in the garage for 5 minutes looking at the truck. The brake line she'd been checking the morning Rourke arrived was still good. She'd verified it 3 days later because the work needed to be done regardless of what had interrupted it. The shop rag she'd dropped was still on the floor near the rear wheel. She picked it up and put it in the bin. She drove to Briar Ridge. The shift was orthopedic recovery and a section of the medical floor, which meant her patient load was stable but high contact. She worked through it with the focus she always brought. Not the performance of focus, not the management of appearance, but the actual, complete direction of attention that she'd first learned in field triage and that had transferred, imperfectly but genuinely, to hospital nursing. In the afternoon, between rounds, Donna called her into the small office off the nurse's station. "Sit down," Donna said. Nora sat. Donna was 61, and had been in nursing administration for 20 years and was not a woman who asked anyone to sit down unless she was about to say something real. "I got a call this morning," Donna said, "from the Chronicle. Reporter named Morrow." Nora went still. "She asked about your employment history here. I told her we don't comment on staff to the press. She said she was going to run a story Sunday and asked if we wanted to provide context." Donna paused. "I called our legal department. They're handling it." "What did Morrow say about the story?" "She said she'd received information suggesting you had misrepresented your credentials at the time of hire." Donna said it flatly, without inflection, which Nora understood was the delivery of something Donna had already decided she didn't believe. "She mentioned your military background specifically." "What did you tell her?" "I told her that your credentials were verified at hiring by our HR department through standard channels, that your nursing licensure is current, and that the rest was none of her business." Donna looked at her steadily. "I also told her that Briar Ridge would be monitoring what gets published, and that if anything in print could be demonstrated to be defamatory, we would respond accordingly." Nora looked at Donna's desk. There was a framed photo of a yellow Labrador wearing a party hat, which was either a very old birthday party or a dog with an unusually festive life. She'd noticed that photo 100 times and never asked about it. "Thank you," she said. "Don't thank me. Your hire documentation is clean. I checked it myself this morning before I called legal." Donna picked up a pen, which was her signal that a conversation was ending. "Someone is trying to muddy water. Water doesn't stay muddy if you don't keep stirring it." Nora went back to her rounds. The Harlan Pruitt terminal access log came back at 3:14 the next morning. She was asleep when Farrell sent it, and she read it over coffee at 5. And there it was. Time-stamped, system logged, from Pruitt's own terminal. A civilian complaint submission routed through the non-emergency line entered manually at 6:47 on the morning of the incident. 11 minutes before Rourke arrived on Caldecott Lane. The complaint listed her address. It described, in specific detail, commercial mechanical work being conducted at residential address, operating without license or permit, customer vehicles observed on premises. 2 customer vehicles. She had no customer vehicles. She had 1 truck on a lift and her own car in the driveway. The language in the complaint matched, almost word for word, the language Rourke had used when he introduced himself. He'd been reading from a script someone had given him. She forwarded the log to Farrell with a single word. Pruitt. Farrell's response came 3 minutes later. "Already in motion. Pruitt brought in for questioning this morning. More soon." She put the phone down and looked at the kitchen wall. Something in the shape of this was clarifying. Not in a satisfying way. Clarification was rarely satisfying. It just replaced one kind of uncertainty with a cleaner, sharper-edged kind. Pruitt had generated the complaint. Rourke had executed the contact. Ellman had managed the communication up to Holt. Holt had tried to contain the fallout. Pullum had run unauthorized surveillance and then made a documented threat. And somewhere in that chain was the person who had decided, for whatever reason, that Nora Voss specifically was worth the effort of a manufactured complaint and a coordinated arrest. She didn't know who that was yet, but she knew how to find out. The Chronicle story ran on Sunday, not the story Morrow had been given by Rourke's source. A different story. Nora had talked to Morrow on Saturday afternoon, briefly, on background, directing her to the credential verification line and to Denton's office for the public record of the charges. Morrow had run the verification line on Friday, which was what Nora had told her to do, and whatever she'd found there had changed the shape of what she published. The headline read, "Kellerton PD under federal review after arrest of former military officer." The subheadline, 8 department members named in widening investigation. Chief placed on administrative leave. Marcus Holt had been placed on administrative leave on Saturday. Nora hadn't known that until she read it in the Chronicle over her kitchen table. She read the article carefully. Morrow had been thorough. The arrest, the credential, the body cam, the manufactured complaint, the Pullum voicemail. She'd been fair in a way that surprised Nora slightly, though she'd been in enough situations to know that reporters were neither uniformly hostile nor uniformly reliable, and that what they were, mostly, was opportunistic in the way water was opportunistic, moving toward whatever opening the landscape provided. Morrow had not printed the fraudulent credential claim. She'd noted that such a claim had been made to the Chronicle by an unnamed source close to the defense, and that the claim had been checked against federal records and found to be without basis. Nora read that sentence twice. She put the paper down and made a second cup of coffee. Her phone had 7 messages by 9 in the morning. Most of them were from people at Briar Ridge: Priya, Spencer, 2 of the attendings she worked with most closely, Donna. One was from a number she didn't recognize and turned out to be a nurse she'd trained with briefly, 6 years ago and 2 states away, who'd seen something online and wanted to know if she was okay. She answered the Briar Ridge ones. She told Priya she was fine. She told Spencer she was at home. She told Donna she appreciated the call. She did not answer the 6th message, which was from a number she didn't recognize, and which turned out to be, when she listened to the voicemail, the attorney Mott. He did not sound like a man who billed confidently by the hour. He sounded like a man who'd woken up to a Sunday newspaper and was doing the math on how much of his strategy had just been printed on page 1. Ms. Voss, I'd appreciate a direct conversation before this goes any further. There may be a resolution available that serves both. She deleted it. She called Denton. Mott called me, she said. He called me too, Denton said, and Farrell, and the state attorney's office. He's looking for a plea architecture. Rourke wants to plead. Mott wants Rourke to plead. Whether Rourke knows that yet is a different question. A pause. The Chronicle story changed his exposure. The manufactured complaint piece specifically. That's not officer misconduct anymore. That's conspiracy. The federal charge enhancement alone. What are they offering? They haven't made a formal offer yet. This was Mott feeling for the temperature. Denton paused again. What's your position on a plea? Nora looked at her kitchen wall. What does a plea do to the investigation? Nothing. The investigation of Holt, Ellman, Pruitt, and the others is separate and doesn't require Rourke's trial to proceed. Then I don't have a position on the plea, she said. That's between the state and Rourke. My concern is the investigation. Understood. And the originator, she said. Whoever decided to start this. Has Pruitt given that up? Pruitt's attorney negotiated a limited cooperation agreement this morning. We should know more by tomorrow. She hung up and stood in the kitchen for a long moment. The trial, when it came, was scheduled for 4 weeks out and lasted 3 days. She had not expected 3 days. She had expected longer, given the scope. But the evidence was specific and documented, and the body cam footage removed most of the ambiguity that trials usually ran on, and Mott, who was a competent attorney even now, moved quickly to limit damage on the conspiracy charge by accepting a modified plea framework that the state's office had agreed to after 2 weeks of back and forth. Rourke pled guilty to civil rights violation, destruction of federal property, and 1 count of conspiracy in connection with the manufactured complaint. He did not plead to the enhanced federal charges. The deal required full cooperation with the ongoing investigation. He received 22 months in federal custody and a permanent bar from law enforcement in the state of West Virginia. The plea was announced on a Tuesday, and Nora was at Briar Ridge when she got the message from Denton. She was in the hallway outside room 4C, which still had Mr. Petrakis in it. A different Mr. Petrakis, a younger one, who had arrived last week and was already testing her patients in a way she found oddly familiar. She read the message, stood for a moment, and then went back in to check his IV line because it needed checking. Pullum went to trial. He did not accept a plea because he had decided, apparently, that his attorney's advice was wrong and that the voicemail could be explained as a personal call mischaracterized. His attorney, a woman named Faye Burdett, who was sharper than Mott and knew it, argued circumstantial context with the specific energy of someone who understood she was defending a bad hand and was going to make them count every card. The jury took 6 hours. Guilty on witness intimidation and 2 of the 3 additional counts. He was sentenced to 14 months and placed on probation following release. His badge was revoked within hours of the verdict. The department investigation ran parallel to both proceedings and was, in its way, more consequential. Captain Roy Ellman resigned before charges were formally filed, which his attorney characterized as a personal decision and which everyone involved understood as a calculation about what cooperation before filing would buy him. He received a reduced charge of obstruction, conditional on full cooperation, and a 2-year suspended sentence. He would not serve time. Nora had opinions about that and kept them to herself, mostly. Harlan Pruitt, who had manufactured the complaint, who had hesitated over the evidence bag, who had been sitting in the lobby of her professional destruction with his fingers on a keyboard. Pruitt did not have Ellman's lawyer. He had a public defender named Morrison, who was 3 years out of law school and working too many cases and did what he could, which was not quite enough. Pruitt pled guilty to fabricating official documentation and conspiracy and received 16 months. Marcus Holt was the longest and the loudest. His attorney fought every element of the obstruction charge, every piece of the phone log, every inference from the Harwick testimony. The proceedings lasted 6 weeks and generated more local press coverage than anything in Alderman County in a decade. And at the end of it, a jury found him guilty on 2 counts of obstruction of justice and 1 count of misuse of official authority. He received 32 months. He would serve at least 22. He lost his pension. The 6 others named by Harwick were distributed across a range of outcomes: suspensions, terminations, 1 additional criminal charge for an officer named Darrell Weeks, who had, it emerged, been involved in 2 prior incidents that the department had buried. Weeks was charged separately, and his case pulled in documentation that dated back 4 years. Nora did not follow every thread of it. She couldn't, and she had learned that trying to follow every consequence of a situation you've been central to is a way of preventing yourself from moving. She read what Denton sent her. She answered questions when Farrell needed her to. She showed up to the proceedings she was required to attend and sat in the same seat at the plaintiff's table with her hands flat on the table and spoke when she was asked to speak. She did not make speeches. She did not perform her vindication for anyone watching. When a journalist from a state news outlet tried to get a reaction quote from her outside the courthouse after Holt's sentencing, she said, "I'm glad the process worked the way it's supposed to," and walked to her car. That was not entirely honest, because the process had worked imperfectly and too slowly, and several people had received sentences she thought were inadequate. But it was accurate enough, and she was tired in a way that made careful accuracy feel like the right register. Tillman testified in 3 of the proceedings. Each time, he was specific and unflinching, and each time it cost him something visible. She could see it in the way he sat in the witness chair, the particular stillness of someone holding something steady that wanted to shake. His position in the department had become, in the months since the arrest, genuinely difficult. He'd been moved to administrative duties. 3 officers who'd been his working partners had stopped speaking to him. He never asked for acknowledgement from her, which she appreciated. She gave it anyway, once, in the parking lot of the courthouse after his final testimony, walking past him on her way to her car and saying quietly and without stopping, "You did the right thing." He said, "I know," and she kept walking. The question of the originator, the person who had decided to send Rourke to her driveway, was answered on a Thursday afternoon 6 weeks after Rourke's plea in a document Farrell sent through the secure channel. She read it at the kitchen table. The name was Gerald Mace. He was not a police officer. He was not an attorney. He was a city council member for the 3rd District of Kellerton, the district that included Caldecott Lane, which she had never thought about before as a political geography. Mace had, it emerged through Pruitt's cooperation and the phone records from Holt's department device, been the initiating contact. He had called Holt approximately 3 weeks before the arrest. The substance of the call, reconstructed from Holt's notes and Pruitt's account, was a complaint about elements coming into the district and a request that the department pay attention to a specific address. He had provided her address. He had provided her name. He had not apparently known what he was triggering. He had known she was black, and he had known she was a renter, and he had believed, because he was a man who believed things that made the world arrange itself conveniently for him, that a phone call to a friendly police chief was a reasonable tool for managing a neighborhood in the direction he preferred. He had not known about the credential. He had not known about the classification. He had not known that the woman fixing a truck on Caldecott Lane at 5 in the morning had once held responsibilities that most people in Kellerton would not have the clearance to be told about. He had looked at her and seen no one important. He was charged with abuse of official authority and civil rights conspiracy, the latter charge carrying federal implications that his attorney spent 2 months trying to argue away unsuccessfully. The federal conspiracy charge arose from the fact that the manufactured complaint had directly led to the damage of a federally classified credential, a chain of causation that put Mace at the start of an offense he hadn't designed but had definitively initiated. His trial was scheduled. And the night before it began, on a quiet Wednesday on Caldecott Lane, Nora was in the garage under the truck when her phone buzzed on the work table. She slid out, wiped her hands, and looked at it. It was a text from a number she didn't have saved, but which she recognized from the area code as the courthouse district. It read, "Miss Voss, this is Gerald Mace. I know this is irregular. I don't have an excuse. I made assumptions about you that were wrong, and I set something in motion that I didn't fully understand. I'm not asking for anything. I just needed to say that." She read it twice. She set the phone down on the work table. She stood in the garage for a long moment. The truck was suspended above her on the lift, the undercarriage exposed. She'd been working on the fuel system, a slow job that required precision and patience and the willingness to get dirty and start over when something didn't fit right. She picked the phone back up. She did not reply. She put it face down on the work table. She got back under the truck. Mace's message was not remorse. Not really. Remorse was something she'd learned to read in the field, in situations where it mattered whether a person was genuinely changed or just afraid of what was coming. And what she'd read in that text was fear wearing the clothes of contrition. He was scared of tomorrow. He wanted something from her. Absolution, maybe, or just the record of having reached out. And she was not willing to give him the thing he hadn't asked for directly, because he knew she'd say no. She lay under the truck and worked. At some point, the wind picked up outside, and she could hear it moving through the gap under the garage door, and it smelled like late autumn, leaf mold and cold stone, and the particular clean sharpness of a night that had decided to be honest about the season. She heard a car slow on the street. She didn't stop working. It passed. She lay under the truck and thought about Gerald Mace and Dale Rourke and Marcus Holt and the chain of decisions that connected them, and the way a single phone call from a man who thought of himself as simply tending to his district had set in motion 8 months of federal proceedings and 8 people's careers and 1 woman's life being examined, documented, cross-referenced, and proven in rooms where the overhead lighting was always slightly too harsh. She thought about what Farrell had said to her once in the field office. Not a formal statement, just a moment in passing, on the way out of a session. They really didn't know, did they? She had not answered. She had thought about answering. The honest answer was no. They hadn't known, and that was not a mitigation, because the not knowing was itself the problem, was itself the act. The willingness to make a decision about a person's value in the time it takes to look at them from across a driveway. The confidence that the person looking back would simply absorb it. The wrench slipped on the fuel line bracket and caught the knuckle of her right index finger. "Hell," she said quietly to the underside of the truck. She pressed the knuckle against her palm for a moment, held pressure, waited. Not badly cut. She'd know in a few seconds. The pain was sharp and specific, which meant surface damage. She'd had worse from instrument trays in triage rooms in countries that no longer officially remembered her presence. She went back to work. The bracket seated properly on the 3rd attempt, which was frustrating and also correct, because most things seated properly on the 3rd attempt if you were patient and did the prep work and didn't try to force a fit that wasn't there yet. She was finishing the last connector when the phone buzzed again on the work table. She didn't stop. She finished the connector. She checked the fit. She wiped the fitting and checked again. Then she slid out from under the truck and stood up and looked at the phone. It wasn't Mace. It was Farrell, and the message was longer than usual, which was already unusual. Trial prep discovery flagged something. Mace's call records pulled a second number during the 3-week period before the arrest. Unrelated to Holt. The second number has a cross-reference in a prior federal file. Checking now, but the connection may expand the scope. Briefing tomorrow morning. This may not be Mace's idea originally. She stood in the garage holding the phone. Outside, the wind moved again. The garage door rattled once, faintly, and was still. If Mace had not originated it, if the call to Holt was itself downstream of something else, something she had not yet seen the shape of, Then the question she'd thought was answered was still open, and the 8 months she'd spent watching a department dismantle itself might be the visible part of something with deeper roots and a different center of gravity entirely. She put the phone down. She looked at the truck. She lowered it off the lift. The briefing the next morning was not in the Morgantown field office. Farrell sent a different address, a federal building in Charleston she hadn't been to before, with a parking structure and a lobby that required 2 separate badge checks. She drove 2 hours in the gray November morning with the radio off, thinking through the geometry of what Farrell's message had suggested. A second number, a cross-reference in a prior federal file, something upstream of Mace. The room she was taken to had better furniture than the Morgantown conference room, which told her something about the level of the people who used it. Farrell was there. Vasquez. Denton. 2 people she hadn't met, a man named Corbin, who introduced himself only by last name, and a woman from the Civil Rights Division of the Federal Attorney's Office, whose name was Dr. Sylvia Tremaine, and who had the particular focused stillness of someone who had spent a career being the smartest person in rooms that didn't always want to acknowledge it. Corbin pulled up a document on the screen at the end of the table. A phone record. A call log with 2 numbers highlighted. Gerald Mace received a call 11 days before he contacted Chief Holt, Corbin said. The call lasted 9 minutes. The number belongs to a man named Burton Aldred. Mr. Aldred is a private real estate developer currently operating in the Kellerton metro area with significant holdings in several neighborhoods, including the 3rd District. Nora looked at the screen. Caldecott Lane is in a target acquisition corridor, Corbin continued. Aldred has been purchasing properties in that corridor for approximately 2 years. Rental properties specifically. He has a documented preference for acquiring properties whose tenants are on month-to-month leases or whose landlords are aging out of management. She understood where this was going before he finished the sentence. My landlord, she said, 74 years old, owns 6 properties in the Kellerton area, has been in discussions with a property management company that we've now connected to an Aldred subsidiary. Corbin looked at her. We believe the intent was to facilitate vacancy, specifically yours, a complaint generating a police response, escalating to a criminal charge, even a misdemeanor, would have given the landlord grounds to terminate the lease. The room was very quiet. They wanted the house, Nora said. They wanted the address. Your tenancy was the obstacle. Corbin clicked to the next document. Aldred has done this before. 3 documented instances in adjacent districts over the past 4 years. Complaints filed, police contact made, tenants pressured into leaving. In those cases, the tenants were in more vulnerable positions. One was undocumented, one was in arrears on rent. They left. Aldred acquired the properties within 6 months of each vacancy. Tremaine said, the prior instances are now under federal review as a pattern of targeted displacement with civil rights implications. How connected is Mace to Aldred? Denton said. Campaign contributions over 6 years. 3 separate development projects in the 3rd District where Mace used his council position to facilitate zoning variances. Corbin paused. They're not friends. They're a transaction. Nora sat back in her chair. She had rebuilt an engine and organized her tools and shown up for shifts and fixed a ceiling fan for a neighbor. And underneath all of it, underneath the quiet, ordinary life she had constructed with careful intention, someone had been looking at her address as a piece of a real estate calculation. Not at her. Not even registering her as a person. Just an obstacle in a corridor. That was almost harder to hold than the rest of it. Not almost. It was harder. Aldred is being charged, she said. Federal charges are being filed this week, Tremaine said. Conspiracy to deprive civil rights, real estate fraud, and in connection with the prior instances, a pattern charge under federal housing law. The combination is significant. She paused. He's also likely to face state-level charges based on the Mace cooperation. Mace is cooperating now. Mace's attorney made contact with our office Monday morning after the call records were disclosed in discovery. Tremaine said it without emphasis, but Nora heard what was underneath it. The very specific sound of a man who had sent a text message asking for absolution, and then, when that didn't produce the result he'd hoped for, gone looking for a deal. She thought about that text. I don't have an excuse. He'd had one ready the whole time. He'd just been waiting to see if he'd need to use it. What does his cooperation get him? She said. Reduce charges. He won't serve time. Tremaine watched her face. I know that's not satisfying. No, Nora said. It's not. She drove back to Kellerton. The Aldred charges were filed on a Friday, and the press coverage was immediate and louder than anything that had preceded it. The civil rights displacement angle, 3 prior incidents now on record, all of them involving black or immigrant tenants, all of them involving manufactured complaints or fabricated lease violations, gave the story a shape that the initial Rourke coverage hadn't had. This was not a single bad officer. This was a system being used as a tool by a man with a business plan. The Chronicle ran it across the top of the front page. A regional news network picked it up Saturday morning. By Sunday, there were 2 national outlets running versions of the story, and Nora's name appeared in most of them, though she had spoken to exactly none of the reporters who wrote them. She went to work. She was in the middle of a medication reconciliation on Monday morning when Donna appeared at the nurse's station doorway with an expression that Nora had learned to read as something is happening, and it involves you. You have visitors, Donna said. Administrative conference room, not press. Hospital administration. I'm mid-chart. I'll cover it. Go. The administrative conference room was on the 3rd floor, which Nora had been to exactly twice in her 3 years at Briar Ridge. It was larger than the family consultation rooms, with a long table and actual upholstered chairs, and it had a window that looked out over the parking structure, and past it, a sliver of the mountains. 3 people were seated at the table. Deanna Holt, the hospital administrator, a man Nora didn't recognize who turned out to be the chair of the hospital board, and a woman in a jacket the color of good charcoal wool who introduced herself as Dr. Patience Osei, no relation to Renata, the attorney, and who was the director of the Regional Nursing Education Consortium. Please sit down, Holt said. Nora sat. We'll be direct, Holt said. We've been following the proceedings over the past several months. We were aware of the situation as it developed, and we provided what documentation was needed to the appropriate offices. We're glad the process has moved the way it has. She paused. We're also aware that it was a significant burden on you, personally, during that period. It was manageable, Nora said. I'm sure you experienced it that way. Holt said it without condescension. What we want to discuss is something specific. Dr. Osei. The woman in the charcoal jacket leaned forward slightly. She had the particular quality of someone who was very good at beginning conversations. Ms. Voss, the consortium runs a training program for nurses working in high acuity and trauma-adjacent environments. We pull instructors from clinical practice and occasionally from military medical backgrounds, though those are hard to find in a way that also includes current clinical experience. She paused. You have both. In a combination we haven't encountered before. Nora looked at her. We're not asking you to leave Briar Ridge, Osei said quickly. We're asking whether you'd be interested in a part-time instructional role, curriculum development, hands-on training sessions, possibly some work with emergency services personnel in the region. She paused again. It's not a glamorous offer. The pay is modest, but we think you have things to teach that aren't currently being taught, and we think you might find it useful to teach them. The board chair, who had not spoken, said, We became aware of the nature of your background more fully through the proceedings. We understand you'd prefer not to have it widely discussed. Yes, Nora said. That preference would be respected entirely. She looked at the window. The sliver of mountains was there in the gap between concrete structures, blue and cold in the November light. She thought about Harold and his hip and his fear of physical therapy, and about Spencer and the defibrillators, and about the attending physician she'd disagreed with about the medication dosage 3 weeks ago and had been right about. She thought about what she knew that she'd never been asked to put into organized language, the gap between what nursing school taught and what a field hospital required, the specific knowledge of how a body behaves under extreme conditions, the difference between managing a patient and keeping a person alive. I'd want to see the curriculum before committing, she said. Of course, Osei said, and I'd want input on the trauma module. We'd expect that. She looked at Holt. My floor coverage doesn't drop. We'll work it out, Holt said. Nora nodded once. It wasn't a yes. It was the shape of a yes that hadn't fully decided yet, which was honest. and she had found over the years that honest shapes were more durable than clean answers. Burton Aldred's trial began 6 weeks later and lasted 8 days. His attorney was the best private defense counsel in the state, a former federal prosecutor named Sylvester, who knew exactly how civil rights pattern charges were constructed and spent the first 4 days attacking the connection between the prior displacement instances and the Rourke incident. It was good lawyering. It was not good enough. The prior instances had documentation. 2 of the 3 former tenants testified. One was a woman in her 50s named Cora Dix, who had left a rental on Elmwood Street 3 years ago after a noise complaint she hadn't made had somehow appeared in city records with her address on it, and who testified for 40 minutes in a voice that stayed steady by visible force of will. Nora sat in the gallery for that testimony. She was not required to be there. Denton had told her the case didn't need her presence. She'd already given what was needed in deposition. But she was there because Cora Dix deserved someone in the room who understood precisely what had been done to her, and Nora was one of the few people in that courthouse who did. When Aldred was found guilty on the federal conspiracy charge and 2 of the 3 housing fraud counts, Nora did not react visibly. She watched the jury foreperson read the verdict, and she watched Aldred's face do the thing that faces do when a reality they've avoided lands finally and without cushion. She had seen that expression before. On Rourke in the courthouse hallway, on Holt when the phone records were entered into evidence, on Mace's attorney when the cooperation deal was announced. It was the face of a person who had believed for a long time that the categories they'd put people into were natural rather than constructed, that the ease with which they'd arranged the world was a sign of their fitness for arranging it, rather than a sign of who they'd arranged it at the expense of. Aldred was sentenced to 4 years and 11 months. He was ordered to divest the Caldecott Lane corridor properties and 5 others in the target acquisition area. The divestiture was managed through a court-appointed trustee and took 8 months to complete. Cora Dix received a settlement from the civil case that ran parallel to the criminal proceedings. Nora did not know the amount. It was not her business to know. She hoped it was enough, and she understood that enough was probably not a number that existed. Mace lost his council seat in a special election 4 months after his cooperation deal was announced. He did not serve time. He moved, as far as anyone could tell, out of Kellerton entirely. She did not follow where he went. Rourke served his 22 months. She did not follow that either. Pullum served 11 of his 14 months with good behavior, which was a term that had always struck her as slightly absurd in this context, and was placed on supervised probation. His name continued to appear in documents for another year as the civil suits processed through. Carl Harwick, whose cooperation had cracked everything open, received the reduced sentence his attorney had negotiated, a suspended term and 5 years probation. He did not return to law enforcement. He took a job, she heard secondhand from Denton, managing logistics for a private medical transport company in the eastern part of the state. She did not have opinions about that she was willing to share with anyone. Tillman was transferred to a different district after the department reorganization.